Kia ora and welcome to the Happy Revolution podcast. In this episode, me and my economist friend Justine interview Peter Fraser. This Peter Fraser is a guerrilla economist, sandblaster and academic from the Hutt Valley, not, notably, the dead Prime Minister. We discuss with Peter the New Zealand economy, the dairy industry, climate change, and what the future looks like for New Zealand in all of this. It's awesome to have you join us, Peter. Thank you very much for making the time. To start with, can you tell us a bit about yourself, maybe how you came to work in economics and why agricultural economics and Māori economic development were areas of focus for you?
Yeah, sure. I'll start off. Peter Fraser. I've always lived in Wellington, out in Lower Hutt. To be more specific, I'm a Hutt boy and a Petone boy from way back. Was schooled out there. Married with two teenage boys. They both go to school locally. That's actually takes up a lot of time, just being dad at home. In terms of career, I describe myself, particularly to a Māori audience, as being somewhat akin to the biblical character Moses, in that I too used to work for the Pharaoh. But the Pharaoh and I had a bit of a disagreement and a parting of the ways, so to say. I worked for government for a very long time. To carry on the analogy, I now wander around in the wilderness and sort of talk to Māori, which is probably a better use of my time anyway. But that sort of brings up the issue of sort of Māori and previous careers. So I'll quickly go there. I whakapapa to Ngāti Hauiti ki Rangitikei. So we're in the Rangitikei Valley. If you sort of go along State Highway 1 and between our southern point is roughly Rata and a little bit north of Taihape going into Waiuru. That's roughly our northern boundary. And I'm part of the Mokai Pātea Confederation. So that's the Māori side of the family. And that's why I've always had a huge interest in issues with Te Ao Māori, but also issues with my own people in particular. Now, in terms of economics, I need to go back to the late 1980s because I'm a bit of a child of the 1980s and a bit of a child of the revolution at the time. And it was such an exciting period of time. I mean, I know we look back now and we look at the new right revolution and that sort of thing, and there's, you look at it with different eyes. But at the time, it was an incredibly exciting period. We had come out of, there was a saying that the 1980s actually started in New Zealand in 1984, but the 1960s actually didn't stop until 1984. I mean, everything changed. Economics changed. Our foreign policy changed. I still remember David Longy at the Oxford Union debate taking on the crazy religious American right. They're still there. It was a period of time where just anything seemed possible. I went to a local school in Petone, which, to be honest, was before Petone was gentrified, and it wasn't particularly high on the decile scale. So being someone that could actually talk, I sort of thought I needed to find a job which actually paid me for talking, because that seemed to be about the only thing I was actually much good at. Now, if we'd had more cable TV networks, I probably would have gone off and been a game show host, which probably would have been a better thing. But I thought I'd be a lawyer because I never saw a poor lawyer, and I thought that was a good starting point. So that went really well right up to the time that I sat the Laws 101 exam many, many years ago and picked the wrong word in statutory interpretation. And there was 45% of the exam straight down the toilet, and with it a budding legal career. So I kind of just sort of bit of an itinerant merchant in ideas and just sort of bumbled around Victoria for about another 18 months, 2 years. Never really went anywhere. Student fees came in towards the end of that period, and I had no money. So I ended up going overseas. And whilst overseas, I ended up doing 2/3 of a economics degree from Massey Extramural. And I did a history degree and an economics degree. After I came back in the sort of like the early to mid-90s, about 94, I came back to Vic, so I just enrolled in both. Sort of 2/3 of 2 degrees was 4/5 of not a hell of a lot. What I ended up doing was to try and get some semblance of order, because my commerce degree out of Vic was, at best to say, eclectic in nature. I tried to pull everything together with economic history. So I had sort of worked well with what I was doing with public policy, it worked well what I was doing with economics, and it worked well what I was doing with history. So all of those streams kind of came together. So that's how I ended up in economics. Now, back to the period of time, I remember being at, I think it was Pat Walsh's lecture, Pubble 201, and it was some nebulous title like The Apparatus and Architecture of the State or some of the damn thing like that. So I sort of bumbled along to the lecture. Anyway, it was 45 minutes of what a terrible place the Treasury was. It was all run by these arrogant, male, right-wing economists who all believed in Milton Friedman, and they ran the world and they completely took over the government, and they were this enormous source of power within the New Zealand political system. And that was actually kind of a shock to me. I just thought, they really sound like my kind of guys. That's the place I want to work. So I decided, I'd go and work there. So Treasury at that time was incredibly difficult to get into. It was right up there with MFAT to try and get in. So I thought, not to be daunted by this. I put in my CV, and that was the year I was just finishing off my undergrad stuff. So it was pretty unimpressive. So that got kicked back, and I said, okay, yeah, that's fine. So I applied the following year, and they kicked me back again. And by this time I was doing my honours year, and it was pretty clear where my marks were going. We'd sort of picked up from earlier. And then they said no. So I said, well, that's not very good. So I picked up the phone and called them up and kind of said, Oi, what's going on here? And they said, well, Peter, to paraphrase Sean Fitzpatrick, he was the All Black captain at the time, your academic record looks a bit like a match of two halves. We could see the better half, the second half is getting a bit better, but that first half wasn't that flash. And I said, well, what happens if I finish my honours? I'm about to go and do master. They said, well, you do that, send it next year. It took me the third attempt to get in. At that stage, I then actually topped the graduation. Now, I found out later, I think there was something like 1,000 CVs sent in, because at that time, actually getting work was quite hard, really hard. So 1,000 CVs sent in. It went down to something like 100 odd people that they gave an interview at the university. It went down to something like 25 people that they actually had a day at the Treasury. It went down to 14, and then I topped the 14. I then was at Treasury for about a decade. Now, I was also in the Territorial Army at the time, so there's a bit of a break part way through where I sort of try to go to East Timor, and I don't make East Timor. I end up going to Bosnia instead. I get posted to a NATO divisional headquarters in Bosnia for 6 months, and that was a fantastic experience. So I did that, but basically in and around Treasury for a decade. Started off with doing health economics. Real irony is that I was part of the team that put together what became the Health Funding Authority, which we tore apart to make DHBs, which we said at the time was the stupidest idea under the sun, because you're going to end up with 23 different health systems, which is exactly what transpired. And now they've torn that apart and basically recreated what we tore apart and created back in 1998. So the world just goes around in circles. The second period at Treasury, because I'd spent a long time in doing health economics and it was time for a change, I then went up to the Natural Resources Group. And so we had Treasury call a departmental budget vote. I had all of effectively the primary sector conservation votes, so everything from LINS to what was then Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, DOC, MFE, etc., etc., etc. So that gave us huge insights into, one, the environmental and also the land-based economics. Time-wise, I'm now in the early 2000s. Around 2005, 2006, I was doing a lot of work with what was then MAF policy, part of MPI. And towards the end of 2006, there were lots of rumours going around the market that Fonterra was about to undertake a major capital restructure. And the last time Fonterra did anything major was its creation back in 2000, 2001. And that was something where officials got caught completely flat-footed and got completely rolled by Fonterra in the dairy industry, or what became Fonterra. It was actually they got rolled by the dairy industry, but it was effectively what became Fonterra. The industry got pretty much what they wanted, and there was not a lot of what officials actually wanted went in there. So with that potentially happening a second time, I was headhunted out of Treasury to effectively lead the dairy desk in MAF. And so I did that for 3 years until I got grumpy with them. So that's a bit of a background.
And then did you leave after
Well, after that, I sort of spent 20 years in government all up. So from 1997. So I went into Treasury exactly the same time that a guy called Winston started off as Treasurer with the last term of the Fourth National Government. So that was Bolger's term. That was his last shot, finished by Jenny Shipley, and her government towards the end was just a complete shambles, to be quite honest. They're trying to get votes through with people like Alamein Kopu, and just awful. And then we had the years that followed. The period I'm now talking about are the Helen Clark years and the fifth Labour government. So that was a really interesting period of time, because I did the MPI thing and we had an amazing deep dive into Fonterra and also into the dairy industry. Because of the extreme concentration of the dairy industry, effectively, if you had 6 people on your cell phone, we had the old Nokias back in the day, you effectively had the entire dairy industry on the cell phone, basically anyone that mattered. In fact, after I left MPI, they got a bit worried because they suddenly realised that they didn't have I think they called it a stakeholder engagement strategy, because the stakeholder engagement strategy with the dairy industry was called Pete's cell phone. And so we went through the GFC, Fonterra's potential bankruptcy, and then after that, I sort of was doing contracting around town. I did some work in no particular order, I went to the Department of Building and Housing, did a whole lot of work on social housing, which was really good work, which then went absolutely nowhere. I mean, sort of thing we talked about was, look, we've got a real problem in New Zealand with house building. I'm talking about 2010, and in Auckland in particular. Now, I can't remember the exact numbers at the time. It's a long time ago, but I don't think I'm a million miles away. Stats New Zealand were telling us, because we knew what the population growth was, we needed something like 10,000 houses to get built in Auckland annually just to keep up with population growth. We were building 3. I remember trying to explain to Bill English. I said, look, if the GFC, global financial crisis, lasts for 5 years and we continue with these build numbers, we're going to have a 35,000 house deficit in Auckland by the mid-2000s. What do you think that's going to do to house prices? And then what do you think house prices in Auckland are going to do in terms of distorting the rest of the economy? Because Auckland is such an asymmetrically large part of the New Zealand economy, because it's our only vaguely international city. I mean, with all due respects to the South Island, there's basically a boat that stops at Picton. There's a McDonald's in a place called Christchurch and some old buildings in Dunedin. The rest of it's just a bloody big national park. So, there are issues like that, just a really simple observation. Now, what happened, the reason we didn't really get any traction with it, one, the department was crazy and was led, there's some difficulties there which you won't go into. But the department was crazy, but then the government got completely sidelined with the Christchurch earthquake. What at the same time they did, after 2012, unexpected to everyone, New Zealand's immigration numbers completely turned around. Because until then, we were exporting just under 1% of our population annually, mainly to Australia, because a 3-hour plane ride and about a $400 airline ticket took you from basically about number 22 in the OECD to about number 6. And a lot of people could actually do the maths on that. Now, what happened after 2012 is a whole bunch of New Zealanders that we would have expected to have gone just plain didn't. And then we had a trickle of people in Australia starting to come back. And then we didn't actually turn down our immigration policy, because we were exporting just below 1%, but then importing just over 1% back. So very simply there, the whole genesis of our housing crisis, which is really 30 years in the making, that was really the point where it became supercharged, because you had a combination of the GFC, which actually led to the starting off of a build deficit, and then you actually had a turnaround in our immigration stats, which we did not handle. We did not handle at all. And then if you jump forward to the COVID years, if you go and chuck $100 billion of quantitative easing into the economy, it's got to go somewhere, and it's gone into house prices. And so that's just an absolute unmitigated disaster. So I then did other work. I did stuff for EQC. I had a horrific job at Ika. I think I'm the only person that's ever been sacked from Ika because I told them their policy was rubbish, which probably wasn't the best career enhancing move at the time, to be quite honest.
Sorry, what's Ika?
Ika was the Energy Efficiency Conservation Authority set up by the late Jeanette Fitzsimons in the Helen Clark years. And they had a policy which was very much influenced by the work of Professor Philippa Houghton Chapman from Wellington and Otago Medical School. And it was really looking at cold, damp houses, because New Zealanders are great at having cold, damp houses. And so they had a retrofitting insulation program. Now, to cut a long story short, I was brought in there as the ex-Treasury guy that thinks a bit differently. And this has been a bit of a hallmark of my career, is that I do think differently. And they say, Peter, we need someone like you to come in because you think differently. And then I turn up there and they go, oh, you actually think differently. We didn't expect that. That's a bit uncomfortable. And that normally doesn't end well. Well, it particularly doesn't end well for me. And in this case, I was there to basically jazz up and rebrand and to rethink their policy. And what I basically said is, because I read all these goddamn papers and that sort of thing, because that's what you do. And so I cut straight to the chase. I said, look, here's the problem with your policy, is that you are insulating places, but that's only one part of the story. I said, what you're actually producing is high efficiency thermoses. It's like a chili bin. Whatever the ambient temperature is, it'll stay there. So if it's cold, it stays cold. If it's hot, it stays hot. You know, there's actually not much in between. So I said, what you need is actually a policy where we actually have heating, ventilation, and insulation. Because unless you have the other two, the third one, the insulation, is the enabler to actually make the heating work. And the ventilation stops your old, cold, and mouldy sort of stuff happening, because we're great at doing old, cold, and mouldy houses. In fact, it's an observation I've had for a while now, that some countries have some issues which are just politically impossible. The dairy industry in New Zealand is a good example. But housing in New Zealand is another. And it's kind of right up there with the states. They can't talk about abortion sensibly, and they can't talk about gun control sensibly. It's just impossible. And we're exactly the same with those two issues here. When it comes to housing, it's a real simple reality that things like rheumatic fever is a third world condition. We should not have rheumatic fever. But the reason we have rheumatic fever is because we can't be bothered not to have rheumatic fever. And the reason is simple, because the kids that get rheumatic fever, firstly, don't vote, and they've got a brown face. And because of that, they don't matter. They rent houses from hard-working Kiwi mums and dads, generally with a white face, because that's what pays for their retirement income. So the simple political reality in New Zealand is the retirement income from about 280,000 mum and dad landlords is a whole lot more important than some kids getting rheumatic fever and dying in their 20s. I mean, that's just the simple reality of it. So after that, and after EQC, I was kind of pretty much over government. I'm an economist, so I can just about explain everything by a 2x2 matrix. So if you can imagine on the x-axis, which for those of you that aren't economists and don't remember maths, that's the horizontal one along the bottom. So if we have along there good department, toxic department, and then on the y-axis, that's the vertical one that goes straight up and down, we have good manager, bad manager. Out of those 20 years, I'd say the vast majority of the time was either in a bad department with a good manager, a good department with a bad manager, or my personal favourite, or which was a bad department with a bad manager. And that kind of just grinds you down after a while, which is why I sort of, by the time I got to 2017, I was kind of heartily sick and tired of the whole damn lot. And to be fair, chunks of the bureaucracy were heartily sick and tired of me, hence the parting of the ways. And so I woke up one morning and decided, well, I might go and do abrasive blasting and surface preparation. So to cut a very long story, I reinvented myself as Pete the sandblasting economist. So I've done that for about 5 or 6 years. And then along the way, I sort of stumbled into various other things. I've got a position at the Institute of Governance and Policy Studies at Vic. I would desperately love to go and spend some more time there. and I'm part way through writing a book on the New Zealand dairy industry, and particularly on Fonterra. So I would love to do that. It's just trying to find enough hours of the day. And I've also had a position with the New Zealand Māori Council, where I'm their National Secretary. But again, New Zealand Māori Council is a government-funded organisation, and they have funding issues as well. So it's basically Pete in the truck, and doing sandblasting is what kind of pays the bills at the moment.
Sounds like a very diverse and multifaceted career.
Oh, very much so. I mean, it's just to give you an example. I ran unsuccessfully, I would sort of take the punchline, for council in the Hutt Valley last year. And what was really interesting was it's almost like what they talk in the music industry about crossover appeal. I can't think of a modern one, and I'm showing my age, but it'd be a Shania Twain-like person who can appeal on the rock charts and appeal on the country charts. And we're at the side of the road just waving signs. And the amount, as soon as I turned up there and started waving signs, all the beeping of horns and that would go through the ceiling, because you'd have all of these Māori guys going past in trucks and high-vis. And I was standing at the side of the road in high-vis waving my sign. And there was someone that looked like them. And that was a really insightful process. Because again, if you look at voting within local government in New Zealand, it's quite low. Hutt was better than most in that we had about a 40% turnout, which was actually pretty good. Big picture, pretty appalling, but compared to everybody else, actually pretty good. And who does that favour? Well, it favours property owners, and I've already talked about the demographics of property owners before. And what was I think really interesting is I was the highest polling unsuccessful candidate who was standing for the first time. I mean, I just basically paid my $200 and, you know, joined a group of people, and we sort of helped each other out, because it's a bit of a daunting process. So I went from woe to go to basically everything in about 4.5 weeks.
Wow.
And I didn't miss out by much. It was only about 800 votes. 10,000 would have got there. I got 9,200.
Wow, very impressive.
Next time?
Not sure. I'd have to, you never say never. The but in the conversation is I really think I'm getting too old. There's a very, very famous saying, whakatauki, which I'll give the English version of, which basically says, the old net is cast aside and the new net goes a-fishing. And that's almost the situation that I think we desperately need in local government. Hutt's actually pretty good. We've got a relatively young council and a relatively diverse council. That's a good thing. But that's an exception rather than the rule. There is still a lot of our pale and stale brethren. And again, I'll just use the example of Fonterra. I was asked about Fonterra's governance by a reporter on Radio New Zealand. And at the time I said, look, Fonterra's actually had 4 chairmen in its entire history, which at that time was not quite 20 years. And I said, I understate the point, chairman. And 3 of those 4 were called John. Now I said, the latest John has actually been there for the previous 10 years. So he's not even a new face, let alone a new name. And I think there's an insight there into some power dynamics that have to change if New Zealand's going to have to change. And I go back to my earlier comment. The last time we broke through anything like that was really in the 1980s, where you had basically the whole generation that sort of fought World War II, like gone within 5 years. And now we're starting to get the baby boomers are very rapidly filtering out. So it's now, Y and the millennials and Z. I'm X, even X is starting to get old. So that's the sort of thing I've got there. If I think I've got something of value to add, then I'll do it. But I don't have time just to turn up at meetings and be in the picture and that sort of stuff.
You've already mentioned Fonterra a few times, and we're quite interested in that. We know that dairy is our biggest source of emissions at the moment, and it is often said that we need the dairy industry for our economy to succeed. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we need to put the dairy industry into some perspective. And the perspective is really, really simple, is that the way we measure the size of the economy is by GDP. Now, we can argue whether GDP is a good measure or a bad measure, and that's actually a fair conversation. but it does measure something. And we can discuss whether that something is a good thing or a bad thing, or should we have more or less, or should we have less of it. Again, that's a fair conversation. But whatever it is, it measures, and that is something that politically has been very important, particularly in the years after World War II. Because generally it's seen to be is that rising living standards has been directly correlated with GDP growth and per capita GDP growth. So that becomes really important. So here's the punchline. The entire dairy industry is 3.5% of GDP. Now what that tells me, because I'll go back to the maths I talked about a bit earlier, is that 96.5% of GDP has precisely nothing to do with anything that goes moo. So what we have here is a huge asymmetry. The dairy industry, they normally come back straight away because that's a number that doesn't work for them, because they like to say they're the backbone of the economy and blah, 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 blah. And at 3.5%, you're not the backbone of anything. In fact, you're really pretty irrelevant. Now, where they do become relevant, and I think we do have to give this to them, is in terms of exports. And they're about a quarter of exports. But then because you can imagine there'll be some farmer in Morrinsville or down in Canterbury who will be saying something like, yes, and it's you people in towns watching your big screen TVs, not that people in rural areas don't watch big screens too. You know, it's because of our exports. Well, let's tease into that. I mean, 25% of exports being dairy suggests to me that 75% have precisely nothing to do with anything that goes moo. Now, if you go back 50 years, the white gold of the day was wool. In fact, it was sheep farmers who were the aristocracy when it came to farming, and it was the cow cockies that were effectively the peasants. Now, it was due to one innovation, which was basically synthetic fibres. And so what that meant, the strong wool industry, which is basically the coarser wool, you know, we've still got people that still want to go and try and save the wool industry, but the wool industry buggered. It's totally buggered. We actually went, what we did then was farmers were quite sensible, basically did a pivot. I mean, the things that went bar weren't making a lot of money. The things that went moo, they made more money. So what they did is they had less of the things that go bar, more of the things that go moo. Now the question we really have now in context of climate change is we've done a pivot once. Can we do a pivot again? I think that's an open question. But here's the thing I've got in the back of my mind is, with the exception of trading of carbon credits, which in the New Zealand context I think is nothing more than a modern version of the trading of indulgences. And to be honest, that didn't wend well last time anyone tried it. So I'm not too fussed with that idea at all. But notwithstanding the issue we have with pine and absorbing carbon through pine, which is actually more profitable at the moment than most dry stock farming, with the exception of that, what happens if the answer to my question about can New Zealand pivot is no, and there's actually nothing to pivot to? And I think this is where there's still an open question around it about the rise of synthetic and alternative proteins. I mean, they've been really highly hyped. But if it comes through the reality is only a fraction of the hype, then basically dairy is the next wool, and it's toast. And it'll be toast quite quickly. And that suddenly means we have to change. But here's the point. And at this point, I'm going to reference and paraphrase my good friend and colleague, Dr. Mike Joy, and also Professor Susan Crumdick, who has done some amazing work on transition economies. And I think we can pull the whole thing back to the modern economy, which in the New Zealand context the dairy industry is very much part of, from an emissions trading or an emissions profile. If you sort of peel it back, what's actually at the base of it, it's really a story about fossil fuels. Now, without fossil fuels, the whole thing falls over. The issue that we have is less so much around population per se, consumption per capita, which comes back to my GDP per capita thing that I mentioned before. We've got a really simple choice. We either stop burning fossil fuels quite quickly, or as a species we go extinct. That's kind of it. Now you're going to have your crazy conspiracy theories and everyone in between there, but look, that's basically the reality of it. If you start to look at, well, how do we replace the energy associated from fossil fuels that we get now, the point is we can't. I mean, Mike pointed out a paper, and I don't have it on me, and I'll paraphrase the dates. I may be a fraction out, but I don't think I'm terribly far. But what it showed is someone who's infinitely brighter than I am did a calculation on a calorific basis of the various sources of energy in the world, from biomass to nuclear to oil, coal, natural gas, etc., etc. And the punchline was, at the turn of last century, the world used something like 80% of its energy consumption came from fossil fuels. Now, in the 20 years since then, because I think the update was done around 2019, world economy is much bigger. I mean, just think of just go and have a picture of Shanghai in 2000 and a picture of Shanghai now. It's not the same city. It's a totally different city. Go to a place like Dubai, exactly the same. Been enormous, massive growth in that 20 years. Well, there's also been massive growth in things like renewables. But what's the figure? What's the bottom line figure? Well, in 2019, it's 82% from fossil fuels. We've not weaned ourselves off them. The point is we cannot wean ourselves off them. The future for us is really a conversation around what does life look like in the advanced world, which, developed world, New Zealand is an example of that, which is a high energy lifestyle. What does 2/3 to 3/4 less energy per capita look like? Because that's what our future looks like, or we go extinct. Now, in that conversation, losing the dairy industry, probably the best thing we can do. It is something that is inevitable, or we go extinct.
So is that because losing the dairy industry means that we will automatically consume less energy? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I will jump in. I'll answer. There's a question that you've got, that if I was in a room of in fact, it's interesting. If I was in a room of economists,
should we ask that?
Yeah,
why don't you ask that one?
What's the question is what your most controversial opinion is, and if you're in a room with other people from your field, so other economists, what's something that you think you'd disagree with everyone else in the room about?
It is my view that the sooner we get rid of the dairy industry, the better. And in particular, because of its concentration around Fonterra. Now, this is not a pet hatred of Fonterra or anything like that. It's simply a public choice theory, rent-seeking argument a la Buchanan. And what that basically says, that when the losses are diffuse and the benefits are concentrated, the people with the few that get the benefits are able to coordinate and lobby much more powerfully than the people that are diffuse. There's only about 11,000 dairy farmers in New Zealand. It's not that big a group. They only do 3.5% of GDP. Sure, they do 25% of exports, but then 75% has nothing to do with them. So I think we need to get a little bit realistic about how important they are. Here's the reason why I see Fonterra in particular being such a problem, because it's stopping us as a country to have the sort of conversations we need, particularly in light of things like climate change. Let me go through. We cannot have a sensible drinking water standard in New Zealand because of Fonterra. Because to have a sensible drinking water standard that doesn't give our people colorectal cancer means a much lower nitrate level. That doesn't suit the dairy industry. We cannot have a sensible conversation around water standards in our freshwater and lowland lakes because that kind of affects the dairy industry. They don't like that. We can't have a sensible conversation about land use change. Now, we've put an enormous amount of cows into the South Island and into parts of Canterbury in particular, which are not dairy country. And it's just a stupid thing to do. Now, the problem we have there is that we cannot reduce it to make it better. So if something's 100% stupid, like putting cows in Canterbury is just a 100% stupid thing to do, then taking away 20% of the cows is still 80% stupid. And that's still stupid. It's a bit like Māori. We don't come in fractions. It's just stupid. We can't have a sensible energy policy because of Fonterra. We can't have a sensible emissions policy because of Fonterra. In fact, there are two rules whenever I'm sort of, or two principles I should say, whenever I get interviewed by a overseas journalist or overseas academic, because their sort of vision of New Zealand is generally shaped by Peter Jackson and Hobbit movies. And they cannot believe with this fantastic countryside, you would then go and have cows crapping all over it. And I say, well, that's what we do. I said, go and look at Waipupu Springs, just outside of Takaka, outside of Nelson. I said it's got the most optically pure water in the world, apart from Antarctica. And farmers want to use it for irrigation, and they're basically poisoning it because what we want to do is have more kilograms of milk solids because that's really important. The answer I'd have there is that there's all of these conversations we can't have because the principles of New Zealand politics are, firstly, 5 million cows are more important than 5 million people. And in terms of lobbying power, big agriculture, so the Feds, Dairy New Zealand, Hort New Zealand, Fonterra, etc., they're effectively New Zealand's answer to the NRA, in that they are the lobby that has an asymmetric level of political power relative to their actual importance and their popular support. And so the sooner we get rid of them, sooner we break them, the better.
There's two questions that follow on from that. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how did we get in that situation where such a group that has a small, relative to its size and relative to its power, such a small amount of GDP, how do they have so much lobbying power? And when you say get rid of Fonterra and get rid of the dairy industry, what does that mean and what would that look like?
Okay, the first thing is that we need to go back. I'll do your first question, which is really, how did we get here? That's a big question, so I'll try and paraphrase, otherwise we'll be here literally all day, all year, and for probably a generation after that. But if we sort of go back to around 1800, 1810, and we have the start of really consistent European contact with New Zealand rather than a dude in a boat floating past and shooting a couple of my relatives along the way. So if we sort of go with that, we really start to understand and see what became the New Zealand model of economic development. So the New Zealand model of economic development is really based on two things. First, there's a version of bonanza capitalism, which is effectively where we take stocks of natural capital, we effectively privatise them, monetize them, and cash them in. And we've done this again and again and again and again and again. So we go through, we cashed in our seals, we cashed in our whales, we cashed in our cowrie, we cashed in the cowrie gum after we cashed in the cowrie. We cashed in our gold. We cashed in the fertility of the natural grasslands. In the 20th century, we cashed in the North Island hill country. If you look at what we're doing now, the dairy industry sits exactly within that pattern because we're cashing in our water. That's what we're doing now. So with this long line of bonanza capitalism. So my first argument is that that's not a great economic whakapapa to begin in the first place. And I don't think that's something we should be trying to preserve. The second thing is that New Zealand economy is based on systemic and quite rapid asset stripping of the indigenous people. I mean, 97.5% of the land in this country was actually provided by Māori. You only have 2.5% left. I'll use my rohe as an example because I'm quite happy to speak about my rohe. I don't really want to speak on behalf of someone else because they're perfectly capable of speaking about their own area. So Mokai Pātia, Rata in the south, Taihape in the north, Ruahini's out in the east and out to the Whangaehu in the west. It's roughly, in the old money, just shy of 1 million acres. Now, because we're inland, Mokai Pātia translates as inland Pātia. And we were one of the last areas for people like Donald McLean to turn up and purchase land. Yet by 1900, we were pretty much asset stripped out. So it happened incredibly quickly. Now, that we have less than, I think it's about, from memory, about 3 to 4% of the land that is within Mokai Pātea is still within either incorporations or individual whānau hands. And of that, something like 80% is landlocked. So, I mean, one of the reasons we've gone into honey was because it's the only thing we can make money out of our blocks on. Because we actually have to fly the hives in because we have no roads to get in there. The areas are completely landlocked. So that's really the pattern of New Zealand's economic development. Let's go up a level. New Zealand is just, the tail end of a 500-year process of European colonisation. So if we sort of look at colonisation as the lens, and I think there is a difference here when we look at, say, a Maori lens of the economy. And again, I'm being very careful here not to sort of go down a Rousseau, noble, savage kind of a route here. But the sort of thing that a Māori perspective would look at is kaitiakitanga and manaakitanga. So what you're really looking at is, are you looking after the needs of the people and are you preserving the environment? That's in a really simplistic, it's a much deeper thing than that. But again, if you sort of cut it to the chase, that's what we're looking at there. And that's something which we're abjectly failing on both counts. I've already mentioned kids with brown faces getting rheumatic fever. We're not looking after our people. So that is where we have gotten to. And I think it's worthwhile, if we look at the colonial economy, what's really some of the key aspects of it. And one of the key aspects of it is that it sets up a global trading system where consumption for local use is basically displaced for consumption in tradable commodities for international trade. So I'm not going down a track here that international trade is bad. I'm an economist, I like trade. I think it's really good. What I am saying, though, is that what colonisation did, and there's a couple of different forms of it. If you look at what the Spanish did, they effectively just asset stripped South America. The galleons are taking away gold and all that sort of thing like that. It caused a massive inflationary problem in Spain, but that's a different story. If you look at the British system, when you look at their form of colonisation, it was mainly around trade. And New Zealand fits very much in that model. What you had was basically products, often commodities, grown in what Europeans called the New World, mainly for consumption in the Old.
I've heard us called Britain's butter factory.
Oh yeah, exactly. Britain's farm, we're now China's farm. But if you go through that sort of thinking, you can say, well, look, what were sort of industries that were there? So you had cotton, tea, coffee, tobacco, sugar. Britain for a while pushed opium pretty hard. That was actually a really useful one when they had to open up China. That's how they got Hong Kong, through the opium wars. What you had was an international trading system. When we look at that in a New Zealand context, what you had was a local economy that basically supplied local needs. Christmas before last, I was talking to Sir Eri Taihakure Jury, and we're doing work on the Ngāti Rakaua, Ngāti Kauwhata treaty claim. And we're just discussing it, and it sort of illustrates this nicely. Ngāti Rakaua know what their population was around 1820. There's no dispute about that. But we had no big land mammals, so what did they do in terms of protein? Well, what you had were extensive wetlands. And within that extensive series of wetlands, you have massive amounts of eels. So what happened is we purposely drained the swamps to put cows there. And I think that very neatly, that juxtaposition sort of shows what happens. If you go to the States and you look at the Plains Indians, Native Americans, it's a bit of a dated term, but they had an economy very much based around buffalo, more correctly called bison, but known as buffalo. You have heroes such as Buffalo Bill, whose claim to fame was systemic extermination of the buffalo. Why? Because if you took away the food source of the Plains Indian, which they called them at the time, then they ceased to be a problem. So this is very much a pattern that the New Zealand economy is very much part of. We got into a track where, if you look at where we started off with, New Zealand company very much wanted to do wheat and sort of things like that. New Zealand's not very much bloody good at that. So wool was what actually gave us our start, because mainly wool was transportable. It was valuable and transportable, but it really, New Zealand as a colony struggled. And it wasn't really until we had refrigeration and what they call the advent of the new staples, which is basically meat and dairy, that really gave New Zealand 3 legs to stand on. But even then, it was pretty touch and go. If you go to the 1930s, the Great Depression was transferred to New Zealand through falling commodity prices. Towards the end of the 1930s, you had the first Labour government trying to do basically managed trade with the UK, where we tried to get guaranteed prices, and the UK told us to bugger off. About 18 months later, a guy called Adolf, who was running a country called Germany at the time, he changed everything, and Britain was suddenly buying in anything we could produce and paying good prices for it. So we've had blips where things have been incredibly prosperous during World War I. Interwar years, not so great. Prosperous World War II. There's a blip in the 1950s around the Korean War. We had an economy which basically we had not very many people. We're the last bus stop before Antarctica, and we grew up in the context of a colonial economy where you basically favoured consumption offshore. And so this is really where you see the New Zealand meat industry, hort industry, and dairy. They're really just the uri. They're the descendants of sugar and cotton and tobacco and coffee and tea. They're just another commodity export as part of a colonial economy. So this is why, for a number of reasons, where I think probably my most controversial one, to go back to that question, is I think it's time that we broke out of the colonial economy. That's almost there's a philosophical reason for that. But if you then add climate change into it, I'll attribute this to my colleague Mike Smith at Iwi Leaders. Mike leads the Iwi Leaders PO on climate change issues, and he absolutely nails it. And he said, what you've got to understand is climate change is just another manifestation of colonisation. And he's bang on the money. And so this is where I'd say we've got 2 reasons here why I think the dairy industry needs to go.
How would you get rid of the dairy industry? Is that like a legislative change that needs to happen?
Well, I'm an economist, so I don't think we need to ban things. I just think we need to have a situation where you can no longer rely on your business model socialising your private costs to the rest of society. It's as simple as that. It's tough as that. We have got, on one side, untaxed capital gains on land appreciation and unaccounted for externalities, whether they be water or air. Let's actually be honest with the greenhouse gas stuff. The idea of having a carbon trading scheme is actually a good one. Emissions trading is actually a really good idea. It needs to have a cap, and we've kind of got a cap, so that's actually a pretty good start. But we've distorted ours mainly because of dairy and agriculture as a step back from that. Because how can you have an emissions trading scheme where you've exempted 50% of your emissions and you put it down a different track? That's just dumb. It's just dumb. And then you can sort of say, we need to do something about it, so we need to design a scheme. So who do you ask to decide the scheme? You ask big agriculture to design the scheme, which is what we've done. And then they design a scheme, and then they can't get it across the line with their own farmers. And so what do? You collapse, which is what the government's done. Now, I mentioned pine trees before. They're just the scourge on the landscape. Farmers, ironically, dry stock farmers really hate them because they say, well, perfectly good farmland's going into pine trees. Well, your perfect good bloody farmland 100 years ago was native forest. So it was, you're the difference. You're the weird thing. You're the weird land use now. But going into pines is not what we should be doing. But because we have distorted our system so much, it's impossible for us to have meaningful reductions for half of our emissions And we basically want to go and trade our way out of the others without actually making any tough decisions. You know, what I'd be doing with the dairy industry is, oh look, if you just had a decent fresh water standard, cows in Canterbury were gone. Cows in Canterbury turned up really fast. There's a guy I was talking to, and he's a retired vet who lives in Wanaka. I got asked to go to Wanaka and talk to a group down there. Lovely part of the country, love it. And he just told me the story about when he first shifted to Wanaka as a vet in 1990, there were 3 cows there, and he knew them all by name. When I went down there, which was in 1919, there were 40,000 cows. And Wanaka is not dairy country. It's semi-alpine. It's a dumb place to put cows. I mean, you look through the Mackenzie country, it's just a dumb place to put cows. I mean, you go through central and mid-Canterbury, how irrigation opened up that area. You go there in sort of around 2010, no cows. Go there 10 years later, 380,000 cows. Now, when you look at the effluent footprint of a cow as equivalent to about 14 people, that's kind of like putting a city of a couple of million people on the Canterbury Plains without a sewage system. It's exactly what we've done.
Can I go back to something you said earlier and just get you to elaborate on that for those of us who aren't economists? You said that what the dairy industry does in New Zealand is socialises its private costs to the rest of society. What exactly does that mean, and what does that look like in the context of the dairy industry in New Zealand?
The easiest way to think about it is pollution, because pollution is generally seen as a bad. And what Econ 1 tells us is that an unregulated market will tend to overproduce the bad stuff and underproduce the good stuff, mainly because neither have a price. So if they don't have a price, because the way that a system works is prices, it provides all your signalling. So if there's no price on nitrogen in the water, then there'll be nitrogen in the water. If there's no price on greenhouse gases, you know, because it's not included in the decision set of the farmer. Because what was included in the decision set of the farmer is what he or she has to pay for. And so this is where we get the idea that what they can do is free ride on the environment. And this is also where we get back to the point about why are they, the NRA, why are they so powerful? Because you've got a relatively small group that produce an enormous amount of pollution and actually make quite a lot of money from it. And if the situation changed, they would actually make massive capital losses. That's worth them to fight for the status quo. This is really no difference. And what we're seeing increasingly out of the New Zealand agricultural sector is the same playbook that's pretty much done by big tobacco back in the day, and also done by the oil industry, that's still being done by the oil industry. They know ultimately they're doomed. But what they want to do is eke the stuff out as long as possible by delaying change. Because what it means is that you can actually, you're kicking the can of your losses into the future and still make money in the meantime. I'll go back to the example about where markets do work. Farmers don't make a lot of money out of sheep as a petting zoo. So we don't have very many. So sheep numbers have absolutely collapsed. Our peak of sheep numbers were back in the 1980s. We had a core flock there of over 70 million sheep. It's now down to something like 25 million sheep. So things can change quite dramatically and quite quickly. And why did that change? Very simply is that there was an economic price signal to farmers that the things that went bar weren't making you money. In fact, there's a great Fred Dagg sketch from back in the 1970s. It's just genius. And it goes, well, we've got the white woolly things and they aren't making much money. So what we're looking at doing is breeding smaller ones so they'll lose less money. We're quite successful in that sort of regard. One thing that New Zealand farmers in particular are incredibly good at is responding to international price signals. But they don't have to respond to what they don't get. And the point is they've been very successful to kick cans of emissions trading, to kick cans of water quality, because either one of those two, it would basically, without your impact of your synthetic proteins and that, which is quite speculative. There's no speculation about this whatsoever. If you actually priced externalities, the cows are gone.
And it's pretty clear, I think, to see how rising emissions, climate change, and poor water quality is really harmful for everyone else.
Yeah.
Probably, I mean, harmful for farmers and their families as well.
And I think I want to just sort of jump in here because again I'll play the devil's advocate, and the farming lobby will go something like, oh, New Zealand's about 2% of world emissions or some tiny figure like that. Blah 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 China and blah 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 the United States and blah 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 India. The issue of climate change, and in particular the issue of levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it didn't happen today, and it didn't happen yesterday. It's accumulated over around 100 years. And if you look at New Zealand's part in that, we have been a major contributor to the problem we have now. So that puts us in a moral position where we should be doing something about it. Secondly, what we did to set up our farms is really no different from what some people with, again, a brown face in Borneo are doing right now. Whereas we burnt down forests to put either cows there or sheep there. That's what we did. What they're doing is burning down forest to put palm oil plantations there. It's exactly the same. But we're morally correct, and they're not. And that's an unsustainable argument. And the third thing I'd sort of push is that, it goes back to my earlier point, is that the issue is less about population per se, because a whole lot of nomads in the Sahara Desert, they don't have much GDP per capita. And they don't use much energy. They aren't much of a problem. It's the developed world with really high GDP per capita, because it's high energy per capita. We're the problem. You can have a situation where you can have a few people effectively over-consuming, but once everyone wants to start over-consuming, then the issue of planetary boundaries becomes a really big problem really, really fast. What's our sort of part in planetary boundaries is getting rid of the dairy industry. I can then hear the dairy industry coming back and saying, but we do food production. Well, up to a point, yes, you do. But you, one, don't feed very many, and two, the ones you feed really inefficiently. One of our biggest, if you look at our red meat export stats, one of our biggest categories is what they call grinding beef or industrial beef, which is basically a euphemistic name for a cull cow. Because once a cow gets to about 5-6 years old in New Zealand, we send it straight to the works, where it gets turned into hamburgers, and it gets eaten by fat Americans. Sorry, dairy industry, I don't think you're on that great a ground. If you really were serious about feeding the world, then here's some really simple stats, which I think just shows just the inefficiency of pastoral agriculture. We have one of the world's leading hop industries, in that we have some really interesting plant varieties. And if you go and talk to the guys that do craft beer, they get really excited about them. And it's all, and we only supply domestic industry, but also we export quite extensively. That's done on 750 hectares of land. If you look at the New Zealand berry fruit industry, it's less than 1,000 hectares. If you look at our stone fruit industry, it's about 3,000 hectares. If you look at our specialty seeds, it's about 7,000. If you look at pip fruit, apples, pears, all of that sort of stuff, about 10,000. Go to kiwi fruit, 13,000. You go to grapes, about 35,000. Go to dairy, 2.1 million. So there's a whole order of magnitude of a couple of zeros difference. And so if you want to be feeding, a bit of a war story from when I was at MAF, trade and industry had this crazy idea back in the early 2000s, or mid-2000s, I should say, of actually exporting New Zealand dairy systems to China. This was all in part of the trade deal with China that Helen Clark's government set up. And to cut a long story short, I was the one that torpedoed it. Trade people out there, it was me. I'll put my hand up for that one. Because it was just such a stupid idea. Because here's the problem. New Zealand in terms, and this is The Economist, New Zealand in terms of resource endowments has lots of land, not very many people, so you tend to be capital intensive in your agriculture. If you go to China, they have lots of people, not very much land. So they tend to be labour intensive. If you look at the amount of, when Chinese came to New Zealand, they were market gardeners because they're fantastic at it. There'd be a tiny little bit of land, and the amount of stuff they'd get off it was much more than what we could do. Truly phenomenal stuff, because their whole history is around actually feeding people on not very much. And so I said, look, the last thing you're going to be doing is if you can find a hectare of grassland in China, you're not going to go and put 3 cows on it, because that's what we do in New Zealand. That's just dumb. It's just dumb. In fact, what we ended up doing, we then went to sort of like Google Maps, early days of Google Maps, and we're sort of looking down into China. And what we found out, I said, look, here's the problem. The areas where you can run New Zealand dairy systems, nobody lives there. It's like inner Mongolia. Mongolians live there. But in terms of the big centres of population, your Beijings, your Shanghais, they're just millions of miles away. Whereas if we had the people, you didn't have the land. So I said, look, if you're going to be doing dairy in China, it's going to be cows and sheds. If you start to go through and sort of think of these things, if you were serious about feeding the world, you would not be doing it with cows. Simple as that.
What value do you see the discipline of economics bringing in the fight against climate change?
I'll go back to the point I made earlier. It's really having the insight about pricing externalities and the ability to get people to make changes. Now, I think that's the insight that economics can bring. But that's not the only insight that's necessary. The irony is it's really public choice theory, which is a really controversial part of economics. If you sort of look at the people that do the history of economic thought, they're very, and because this is the school that's led by the likes of James Buchanan, the Virginia school, and it basically says, budget maximising bureaucrats and rent seeking and all that sort of stuff like that. They've gone into Buchanan's files, because he's long since passed away, got the Nobel Prize, by the way. But they find that he was pretty much paid, his centre was funded by the Koch brothers. So not exactly the nicest kind of a guy. And as I said, a very controversial branch of economics, and really came from economics' high tide period of imperialism, where you had various branches of economics going off and devouring other things, devouring sociology and political science and a whole bunch of other things like that. A lot of that came out of Chicago. But nevertheless, there are some insights in there here that are actually really important. And the really important insight is why economics can say we have to actually price that. We aren't going to get sensible decisions until we price it. And an unregulated market won't do that. What your public choice theory tells you is it's really hard to regulate markets because of rent-seeking activities. And that's exactly what your public choice would tell you. There's an insight into how you can start to solve the problem, but then there's actually a more important thing about saying why the problem's going to be unsolved, because it's just too hard.
And then is there any way forward from there?
There's a question of, am I hopeful? I'd like to say yes. Probably going to say no. I mean, we've already pushed through 1.5 degrees. I mean, that's gone. So the question is really how much more over, how soon? In a world where we were well below 1.5, we could have arguments about short-lived gases and long-lived gases and methane and farmers and kick the can down the road for another 20 years. But the point is that breaching 1.5, methane being a short-lived gas, which has got a huge heating potential compared to CO2, and it's my understanding is that, because they say, but it all breaks down. Well, what does it break down into, sunshine? It breaks down into CO2. So it goes from something that's really bad just to something that's bad, and therefore you think we should do nothing about it. Well, I'm sorry, farmers, it doesn't work like that. But the point is, in New Zealand, it does work like that, because that's how we run things. That's what we do. As part of the New Zealand Māori Council, I was one of the Māori responses to the Resource Management Act reforms, because the current government is looking at replacing the 30-plus-year-old RMA with a new piece of legislation, Natural and Built Environments Bill. The RMA was very much an economics piece of legislation, and that it basically was you had something that was decentralised. Economists like decentralised, we don't like central planning. So it was decentralised, and it was basically around, it was permissive, and that you could do pretty much what you wanted as long as you worked out how to internalise your externalities. That was basically the gist of the RMA in a nutshell. And again, it came from a period of time where economics dominated the whole public policy discourse in New Zealand, the late 80s, early 90s. So that's not at all a surprising outcome. But the problem was no one actually worked out how to internalise the externalities. And there's all these things about balancing, and that all basically came tumbling down in a great big mess. So if you have something that's around internalising externalities, and they don't know how to do that, and then it comes down to balancing, and they don't know how to do that, well, you just have a mess. So it's got to go. So what they're now looking at is the new idea is environmental bottom lines. What the problem we have here is it's one of those things that, again, sounds great in theory, but I tell you now it's going to fail in practice, so you heard it here first. What they've done is, and I think quite sensibly, they said, we're going to put economic development and environmental preservation in the same legislation, because somewhere along the line, those two will butt heads. And you either have it in the same bit of legislation and try and have that butting of heads within that piece of legislation, or you have two separate pieces of legislation and you go to court all the time. There's a judgment call either way. My personal view is that I think keeping the integrated piece of legislation is probably the right way to go. Here's the problem with your bottom lines, is that ultimately, somewhere, someone has to set the bottom line. Because the bottom line is this environmental limit. The idea is that you can, is again permissive, you can do what you want to do as long as you don't breach the bottom line. Now the problem we have here, as I've said, is who sets the bottom line. I spent a great deal of my time, with this piece of legislation, was to effectively try and dairy New Zealand proof the legislation. Because as we've already discussed, in New Zealand, it's impossible to have a conversation about greenhouse gases that's half sensible. It's impossible to have a sensible conversation about including agriculture into an emissions trading scheme. It's impossible to have a sensible conversation around energy. It's impossible to have a sensible conversation about land use. It's impossible to have a sensible conversation about so many different things. So the analogy I used was, and again, I'll go back to my 1980s view, is that we had a real problem throughout the 70s with inflation. And in particular, we were especially bad in New Zealand because the Prime Minister at the time, who was also the Minister of Finance, Robert Muldoon, what he would do, and he did this in 1978, and he did it in 1981, is that he would artificially pump up the money supply about 12 to 18 months prior to an election to give the impression of more buoyant economic conditions during an election year, because governments generally lose elections if you have a recession in your election year. So he would try to recession-proof his election campaign. What that meant was that we barely got inflation under control before we let it out. He let the genie out of the bottle again. So when Douglas came in with the fourth Labour government, he got explained that this is what was happening. And his direction was really simple to officials. We need to Muldoon-proof monetary policy. How do we Muldoon-proof monetary policy? Because he was very aware that he could not bind his successors. So if his successor was another Muldoon, we're back into the mess. So the argument, or the solution they came upon, was an independent reserve bank and inflation targeting. Whereas the role of the government was to basically set the parameters. You need to go and have inflation between this and this. Go off and do it. I see exactly the same situation here, whereas what my concern is, and I think the concern's well-founded, is that all of the bottom lines that matter will be captured by the likes of Fonterra and Dairy New Zealand. Because we've already seen it within climate change. We've already seen it in freshwater policy. We've already seen it in so many areas. This is not speculative. It's already happened, past tense. So to somehow expect it's not going to happen again, I think is a little bit Pollyanna. There's that saying is that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. We are going to do the same thing again and again. We're going to get the same result. We know what the result is. So that's why, to be honest, it's with that public choice thing. I'd love to say that I'm really optimistic, but I'm not. I'd love to say that, yeah, we're going to have, sustainable energy and we'll just rock on. No, we're not. I mean, we've had 20 years, huge investment into alternative energy, and it's not. I mean, what our future looks like is, firstly, economic growth is gone. We then have to take energy out of our consumption patterns. That's not going to be easy or fun. And I'm not quite sure how we can actually do that. So this is where I sort of come through and say, I mean, you've got we're going to have hydrogen, which is just stupid, and all of these other things. So the problem we have is really, really simple, in that when we look at energy, our alternatives, they're just too inefficient to use. I mean, the whole idea that we're going to, replace our whole car fleet with electric vehicles is just nuts. It's just totally nuts. I think we have to be careful, because you've got the crazy dinosaurs that say, well, look, I'd rather keep my Humvee because it's old than have a modern vehicle, particularly electric vehicle. But the point is, mass personalised transportation doesn't work in an economy with 2/3 less energy available. It's kind of that simple. But the simple things are really, really unpalatable. We could solve the problem of our greenhouse gases like that. We get rid of 1 million cows out of the South Island. At the same time, we actually fix our water problems. Same time, we actually go and fix our land use problems. A whole bunch of other things happen. Just on that energy, this is, again, a while ago. I did work on Tiwai Point when I was at Treasury way back in the day. And this is when we're doing the early work about what became Helen Clark's emissions trading scheme, which then, when the Nats came in, they promptly dismantled, which was just crazy. Comalco, as it was then, Rio Tinto now, at the time they were using about 14 to 15% of New Zealand's electricity production, and that came directly from Manapuri. It came through a line directly to the plant. So it was actually a stranded asset, which is why the consortium basically had the government and the power companies, Meridian in this case, pretty much over a barrel. But they've now gone and put a diversion in where they now can, or are about to, be able to redistribute a lot of that electricity back into the national grid. The best thing that could happen to New Zealand, to be quite blunt, is the sooner they get rid of Tiwai Point, the better. Yeah. Now, here's the problem. Let's say you had a company called Fonterra that burns a shitload of coal to dry milk. I mean, let's just... I want to pause here for a moment, because a mate of mine, about 3 years ago, it was just before COVID, called me up, because he trades electricity futures, things like that. So he called me up and he goes, Pete, apart from Auckland and the Tiwai Point smelter, do you know which is the biggest user of electricity at the moment in New Zealand? And I go, no, James, but I think you're going to tell me. And he goes, Ashburton. This is in February. And I said, well, it's not rugby season. So I said, the farmers aren't going to be watching those big screen TVs that their 3.5% of GDP and 25% of exports pay for. So it must be something else. And it's irrigation. Something like 2% of New Zealand's electricity was going in there. So let's actually look at that as an economic model. You've got an area which is basically a desert, and you go and put a water-hungry animal in a water-scarce area. You actually use an enormous amount of energy to irrigate the living daylights out of what is effectively a beach in the middle of summer. You then go and burn more fuel to pick up the milk, and you put it into a factory where you burn an enormous amount of coal, because milk is about 88% water. So you take the water out, and you then put it into a 20 kilo bag, put it on a 1 ton pallet, put it in a 40-foot container, and send it somewhere around the world, burning a whole lot more energy. You then put the water at the other end back into it. Now, tell me, in a carbon-constrained world, how that is vaguely sensible or vaguely morally defendable. It's not. We don't do morals very well in New Zealand. The kids with rheumatic fever tell us that. That's just too hard. I'd love to say that I'm really optimistic, but the point is, I'm just not. I'm just not. I think the only thing that will actually stop the dairy industry, because we can't, it's just too hard. As a country, we can't. The only thing that will stop it is if the alternative proteins and the synthetic proteins live up to their hype, because that will do to dairy what nylon did to wool, and it will do it quite quickly. When I was at university, I did a paper on the emergence of modern Israel. What was really interesting was looking at Jewish philosophy towards the end of the 19th century. And they sort of got the idea that, and again, I'm hugely simplifying, that you could actually redeem yourself. You didn't actually have to wait for the Saviour to come and save you. You could actually get off your bum and do it yourself. And that basically led to the Zionists, and we all know where that sort of ended up. But what we're basically saying here is that we can't save ourselves. What we're hoping for is some exogenous event that can save it for us, because we just can't do it, because it's just too hard.
What do you think about changing consumer preferences? Do you think that's much of a force?
In terms of dairy,
Yeah.
won't make any difference. You know, there's a stuff around, for example, oat milk. I've got my home state daughter. She's lactose intolerant, so she has this bloody oat milk in the fridge. I mean, to be honest, I'm old and grumpy and bad tempered, and I like milk. I like cheese. I'm of a generation that's kind of like that. And that's not an apology. That just is, and is. So I'm part of the problem as well. But if you look at the New Zealand dairy industry, firstly, about over 95%, even probably closer to 97%, is exported. The amount we consume here is a fraction. It's a tiny, tiny amount. And if a small percentage of a tiny amount is gone to something alternative, it's basically no difference. You know, when you start to look at measure, it becomes, it's basically less than background noise. What we do is provide ingredients, and we provide ingredients normally in a powdered form, whole milk powder, and that is really our biggest export. Now, we do lots of different variants of it, the same way that ExxonMobil does lots of different variants of petroleum, but it's basically hydrocarbons. And what we've got here are basically a bundle of fats and proteins and sugars. That's what it is. And it basically becomes filler for a whole bunch of other products, the same way that there's sugar in everything. In many cases, there's actually milk powder in a whole bunch of things. Because if you're looking at industrial production, it's much easier to have powdered milk than liquid milk. It's just easy to handle and easy to store. So the vast majority of milk in the New Zealand case is not for direct consumer goods, which you think about on your supermarket shelf. So you sort of think about, milk in a bottle, yogurts, cheese, butter, those sort of things there. That's tiny. I was interviewed for the film Milked, the documentary, and we had a follow-up to that.
I've seen that.
Yeah, which I was the most depressing person there, because they were all sort of going, yeah, we need to go and drink our oat milk and it'll be really great, and we need to mobilise and raise consciousness of consumers. No, it's going to make no difference. Because here's your thing. Fonterra, in many ways, the analogy I draw is a bit like Intel, in that for many years, and I'm not quite sure who does the fastest chips now, but if you've got any sort of computer, whether it be a Dell or whether it be an IBM or whether it be anyone else, you'd have Intel inside, because they provided the chips that made the damn thing that work. What Fonterra does, you don't get the Fonterra inside, but if you go to a Milky Bar and you look on the back of it, it'll have all the different ingredients there. It'll have milk solid, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a whole bunch of things like that. That's effectively your Fonterra inside. Now, the point is that when you're getting a Milky Bar, I mean, there's even a case that they use particular milk products when making varnish. So here's your thing. You go into Bunnings, you're buying some varnish. Are you going to be thinking about the dairy industry? No. You're going to be thinking about whether it's sustainable? No. You're going to be thinking about, is it grass-fed? No. Are willing to pay any more for that? No. There seems to be the idea that if we add value, we can have fewer cows and therefore get out of it that way. We've been trying to add value for 50 years. We've failed at it. if we've not actually been able to do it in the last 50 years, I don't think we're going to do it in the next 2. And this is the thing, is the whole reason to bring Fonterra into existence. The argument from the dairy industry was that it allows a once-ever opportunity to transform the dairy industry. And when they talked about transforming the dairy industry, they wanted to move it out of a very strong commodity space into what they called a value-adding space. Now, what the value-adding space actually meant was up in the air, but it definitely wasn't 20-kilo bags of whole milk powder, 1-ton pallets and 40-foot containers. And Fonterra has systematically failed to do that transformation. So its whole reason for being set up, it's failed to do. So farmers didn't keep their side of the bargain. Because remember, Fonterra was not formed by farmers. Fonterra was formed by Parliament. It is a creature of statute. Because what the farmers wanted was actually illegal. It would not pass New Zealand's competition policy. They'd already been to the Commerce Commission in the late 1990s, and the Commerce Commission basically said that they're totally nuts. And so what farmers did, or farmers' leaders did, is they used their privilege. And their privilege was they wanted to have the law changed just for them, to be able to create what they wanted. And that's exactly what they got. And the quid pro quo is that at that time, Helen Clark's government was very much after transforming the New Zealand economy. How do we do that? How do we get a national champion? This is the story about Fonterra being New Zealand's Nokia. It's just been an abject failure. And not only has Fonterra not managed to execute that change, the point is we now know that it never will be able to. It just can't do it. So this is the thing here. We can't do, for example, what Ireland did in the 1980s, because they joined what was then the EEC, now the European Union. That led to a huge modernisation of Irish agriculture, and they're a useful comparison because they're a grass-based system like us. And they had massive growth in the decade between 73 and 83 in their milk production, and the Irish industry basically grew off the back of that production. But then they got the flip side of getting all those EU development subsidies and regional development subsidies. They then got milk quotas imposed on them. So they were not allowed by European regulations to increase milk production. So they were stuck at a particular level, which is effectively where New Zealand is now. So what the Irish industry did, with some growing pains and some other things, is they basically flipped themselves into be basically a food industry. Now, New Zealand's not been able to do that. And despite the Irish example being extensively cited back in 2000, we've just not been able to do that. Because what you've got to remember is ultimately what Fonterra is. It's effectively a wealth creation, that was it started to be, but now increasingly a wealth preservation mechanism for farmers. That's its reason to exist. That's why we don't have sensible policies about anything. Because farmers don't like it that way. It doesn't suit them. It doesn't suit their balance sheets.
I've just got a tangent question from something you said before. So you talked quite a lot about energy consumption.
Yeah.
Do you think energy consumption is a problem if the energy is renewable energy?
Energy consumption is, the short answer is yes. And the reason for this goes back to an argument or concept that's called energy return on energy invested. So it's almost a bit like energy lotto. And I'll just give some numbers to illustrate. So what it basically says is, how much energy do I need to put in to get a unit of energy out? So if you look at something like Saudi crude, you just basically drill a hole in the ground and it just pops out. So it's very easy to abstract and it's very high quality. So what you get there is something like, for every 1 unit of energy you put in to extract that, you get something like 50 units back. So hence my analogy with like you won the jackpot. Little in, lots out. Now, if you start to use all the good stuff up, what economics and Ricardo will tell you, you then go to the more marginal sources and the harder ones and deep sea drilling in the middle of nowhere and, deepest, darkest Africa and wherever you try and find the oil. Now, if you look at something like the Canadian oil sands, they're down now to, they're barely viable. They're down to like 1 in 5 out, 1 in 4 out. That's the sort of ratio. So when you've got energy consumption is increasing and you're having to get it from the harder things, that becomes really tough. So that's one of the reasons why the relative price of renewables have actually come down. But let's actually apply the same maths to renewables. If you look at something like solar, and if you look at wind, in terms of your ratios, they're much more like your Canadian sands than your Saudi crude. So the actual sheer scaling up of what you need becomes really, really tough. Now, I had to explain this to some of my whānau. So I used a much simpler analogy. So this is the analogy I'll use here. Imagine you've got a pride of lions doing pretty well somewhere on the African savannah. And they're making a pretty good living out of wildebeest. And then suddenly the wildebeest are gone. I don't know, there's some wildebeest version of foot and mouth, whatever. Double gone and evaporated. So you say, well, that's actually not very good. We need to diversify our production out of wildebeest. So you hit upon the idea of, look, we'll start chasing these meerkats. And the lions find it's pretty bloody tough to actually eke out a decent living out of meerkats because they pop up and they're hard to get and it's difficult. So what they then decide, okay, well, giving up on these meerkats, we're going to go to alternative. Let's farm hamsters. And that's effectively what we're doing as a society. What we're saying is that we've been living off wildebeest, and our solution is to start farming hamsters. And in the last 20 years, we've actually farmed some hamsters, but our reliance on the wildebeest has not gone down, it's gone up. So that's what I'm saying is that renewable energy is just a facade, just a total facade. Now, if you go and look at the great hope, things like hydrogen, hydrogen is just the stupidest thing on the planet. One, because it doesn't exist in the planet. I mean, I love the, firms like Hyundai and other rent seekers out there pushing it. They say it's the most abundant element in the universe. Yes, you're quite right. But the fact that it runs the sun, we don't have it here. On Earth, it's really unstable and likes to join with other things, such as carbon. That's why we have hydrocarbons. Hydrogen doesn't exist on its own. We actually have to make it. And therein lies the problem. I mean, the maths for hydrogen is actually makes Canadian oil tar sands look really good. It's like 3 in, 1 out. So here's the problem you've got, is that hydrogen is not a source of energy. It's just a really complex and inefficient way to store energy. So this is why I'm sort of saying is that, there's this big hope that we'll go to renewable energy. Well, we've tried to go to renewable energy for 20 years. We've built shitloads of it. Has it made any difference? No. And so why hasn't it made a difference? It's a bit like the saying, you can't outrun a bad diet. So if you're sitting in front of TV watching some daylight soap operas and, scoffing, chocolate biscuits, you're not, and then you say, well, I'm obese. And I've got a BMI that's kind of through the ceiling. Having a walk around the block isn't going to fix it. You can't outrun a bad diet. And that's our thing. We're trying to outrun a bad diet.
Do you think that as time goes on, there's a chance that instead of farming hamsters, we'll be farming wildebeest, as in the renewable energy sources will give us enough energy? Or do you think that it's a matter of, as society, the way that we live needs to completely drastically change?
And this is really where, if you're the, my colleagues call this hopium. where it's a mixture of hope and opium, where you're just hooked on some technological change. Again, it's much the same as what we talked about, the exogenous shock, that there is some saviour that's going to come down and save us, so we don't have to make any decision ourselves because it's just too bloody hard. And so in that sort of world, the issue is the physics of these things are known, and they're pretty much immutable. The second laws of thermodynamics is pretty set. It's not negotiable. So, to try and make these things work, what you're really hoping like hell is that we can make nuclear fusion work. Because if we can make fusion work, then everything changes. But if we don't make fusion work, then, if you start looking at what has got a relatively high energy return on energy invested, hydro is normally pretty good. Nuclear is good. And geothermal is not great, but it's sort of around the 20s versus it's not up around the 40s and 50s, but it's actually pretty good. So those are some options available. So unless we can do something around, the issue we've got with alternatives is they're basically really inefficient. Because at the moment, the alternatives we've got, the good ones are hamsters, the bad ones are ants. And what we've been feasting on is wildebeest. And what we've kind of got with something, so what we need to find is an alternative wildebeest. And pretty much the stuff that we know is either nuclear fusion or nuclear fission. They're your two big ones. Now, one of them works and one of them doesn't. I see that the scientists have managed to get, a fusion reaction sustaining, I think now for 2 minutes. Well, that's great. That's really going to keep the lights on in Auckland. So this is where I think there's some really quite brutal realities, and what climate change is doing is actually taking away our time to react, to respond, and so we're rapidly running out of runway. If it was a case that we, because in New Zealand we just hate doing things which are tough, and we just love kicking the can down the road. When you don't have any more road, you can't get the can any further, and you're at a dead end. So this is really where, in a whole bunch of things, it comes down to, we are, as a country, but in more broadly as a species, we have hooked ourselves into an economic model which is not that flash looking after people, and basically not that flash in looking after the biosystems of the planet that we need to survive. And we find it really difficult to change that. And what we're hoping is that some miracle happens. If you're religious, it's like a saviour that turns up. If you're a scientist, it's a breakthrough. If you are an environmentalist, it's a technological change that means the dairy industry's toast. But what it basically says is that we are disabled. We are not able to do it ourselves. And that's why the insights from public choice theory, I think, are really, really interesting, as controversial as they are, because it's exactly what they predict. Let's say it's just too hard. We can't make change. We just can't do it.
Do you think, with this economic model that's bad at looking after the environment and people, you spoke a bit earlier about a model of Māori economics based around manaakitanga.
Yeah. And this is, and again,
what can we learn from that?
Well, this is really a story around, Māori are not unique in this. You go and look at Australia and the Aboriginals, and again, being very careful not to be the Rousseau here, because if you look anywhere in the world where people turned up, as soon as they turned up, the megafauna disappeared pretty quickly. If you look at Australia, they had things like marsupial rhinos and really big stuff. They don't have them now. New Zealand had the moa. You had, this is where North America with the buffalo was actually slightly different. They had a better reproduction rate, and again, relative population balance was actually kept in balance. I'm just, as I said, I'd like to be optimistic, but I can see no reason to be. But looking at your Māori economy, I'm doing some work with a very good colleague of mine, Professor Paul Tapsell, And we're actually looking at kāinga. And kāinga are your traditional Maori villages. And really, I think the easiest way to explain kāinga to just a layperson is from a sociological perspective, we talk about Māori society being at three levels. Full. You have a whānau, or if you add whānau 4, you have a whānau level, you have a hapu level, you have an iwi level, and then you can actually have over that, you can even have iwi confederate again. And I think Tainui is a great example of that, where you have effectively a regional thing. But you normally your whānau, hapu, iwi, those are your big dynamics. Now the base of that society is your hapu. Now, when we talk about kāinga are really the geographical expression of that, because hapu have to live somewhere. Where do hapu live? Hapu live in kāinga. Now, it's a lot more sophisticated than just, for example, the European concept. If you say go to England, you have the village. It's a little bit more sophisticated than that, because these are socio-political economic systems. And the thing which I find interesting is that they managed to give, by the standards of their time, relatively good living standards and relatively good life expectancy in a low energy environment. And looking back is that's kind of an interesting proposition. I mean, there are politicians, and they'll remain unmentioned, that sort of say, well, the Maori should be really happy about colonisation because beforehand they were lucky to live to 30. Well, you go and have a look at Manchester in the 1840s and see what the life expectancy was like then. For Indigenous people, they often had better life expectancy than the dark satanic mills of England. I've got relatives, because if you've got a name like Fraser, these are linked to Scotland, and they're still pretty angry about the Highland clearances. Very angry about it. And it wasn't that long ago. So there is basically, if there's only one insight that we've got from Indigenous peoples, it's a story around looking after people, looking after the environment. Now, that can all go down on lots of different tracks, but that's a fundamentally different view than what we have now around the accumulation of wealth and property and power. It's a fundamentally different view. Now, again, I'm not saying that there were not some really nasty things. I mean, I took my boys through the Wairau Army Museum, and we had the guy giving us the tour. And we sort of got to the period about what Europeans call the musket wars. And I kind of pulled him up. And I said, look, musket wars, I said, if anything, the issue here was not just muskets, it was actually potatoes. And he kind of looked at me. And I said, well, look, Ngāpuhi were the first major group of Maori that managed to have extensive contact with Europeans. Now, what that very quickly, unlike other Indigenous peoples, what Māori were very adept at were trading. And in the north, you could actually grow, because of warm weather, you could grow things pretty well. Now, when the potato turned up, it kind of revolutionised things, because you got a lot more productivity per hectare, which led to a surplus. Now, if you had a surplus, it means you could trade them. I mean, it was Māori potatoes that fed Sydney for years. So you have a trading system developing quite quickly. Now, if you've got a surplus that you're trading, you then trade it to buy something. And what they bought were guns, muskets. Now, so there's your first feedback loop. Now, the next feedback loop was, if you have a society with deep-set ideas around mana and reciprocity, also known as utu, and a memory that goes back forever. If you suddenly have muskets, well then anyone that you have been angry with and a bit pissed off about for the last forever, now's the time for you to go and sort things out. And that's effectively what happened. I mean, in terms of my iwi, we have a story around, because we are on now what is State Highway 1, which is basically a Maori road. And because it was a sensible place to walk through the country. if you're going to go through central New Zealand. And people at the time, Māori going through there were saying, well, it's bloody empty. That's because we weren't stupid. We knew what happened when the guys that turned up, when the men turned up with the sticks that went boom. That was not a good place to be if you also didn't have the sticks that go boom. So we would bugger off into the hills and not be seen, because it was a much more sensible way of actually dealing with things. Now, we have a story about this enormous amount of kiraru, wood pigeons, preserved in their fat that we had to trade to get our first muskets. Now, back to this whole dynamic with potatoes. What potatoes did was it allowed an additional amount for a surplus to buy guns. They stored better and they grew more quickly. So what it meant is that if you were out with a war party, a taua, you could actually fight much longer. Because I don't want to sort of put it down to sort of like a rugby season, but you had a natural season, whereas if you were a horticultural-based hapu, you had to basically stop fighting at some point, go back and put your crops in. Now, if that limit was taken off you, then boom, you could fight a lot longer. So it meant that you could, Ngāpui got down to Wellington. They're in the far north and they walked. They didn't jump on the train. So it meant that your whole nature of warfare changed dramatically. But here's the final kicker, is that if you went and actually captured a whole lot of slaves, took them back, they could grow more potatoes. So what you have is basically this death machine. Now, our economy now is the same death machine. That's what we've got. We're basically feeding off ourselves. So, Māori, there is nothing special here. When things changed, we were as good as producing a death machine economy as anybody else. But we also, like a lot of indigenous peoples, because we didn't have access, and to be honest, Europe was much the same as this as well, until you had there's the revolution around access to inanimate energy. It was that thing which basically supercharged everything that we now know as the Industrial Revolution, which basically started off in England in the 1800s. Sorry, mid to late 1700s, 18th century. And what that did is it meant that it actually made rising what we now call GDP growth possible, but more importantly, it made rising per capita GDP growth possible. Because you can look around countries like, empires such as the Chinese Empire or Indian Empire, they had GDP growth, but they didn't have GDP growth per capita. What energy did was democratized GDP growth. And that's the thing that's killing us.
To circle back then to the question of hope, you mentioned that hope and optimism is something that you don't have a lot of, but you've also said that you ran for council and that you work on books and things like that.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to know where does the drive for stuff like that come from? Because particularly it seems to me like something like standing for council is something you do to affect change. Yeah. And if you don't have any hope, where does the desire to affect change come from for you?
Yeah, it's a thing that as I said, I'm a father of, I've got 2 kids, and I'm now at the age where I'm now, Uncle Peter to, again, 2/3 of the bloody North Island. It just happens with the passage of time. You can't just curl up and die. You can be brutally realistic, but you do give it a go. But you're brutally realistic about what you can, about what change you can actually affect. And this is one of the things that it just comes over time. There's a meme that sort of floats around. It comes through on my Facebook feed. Again, it shows I'm old and bloody decrepit because I don't do anything cool like Instagram or anything like that. I've no idea how that works. But it sort of has a Morgan Freeman type character. I think it might be Morgan Freeman that sort of says something like, you come to a certain point in your life where you're permanently unimpressed by a whole lot of shit. And that's kind of where I'm at. So so I'm not at the give up and die and sit on the hill and wait for the Messiah to turn up. So we're not in that world. So I will give it a go, but I'm just brutally realistic about what it will actually get to. And so this is where the optimism I had when I left this place, 30 odd years ago, that's long since gone. Actually, again, with the 80s, everything seemed possible, and then actually being in Treasury and that, you sort of say, well, no, it's not. It's nothing like sitting across the table from a whole lot of Fonterra lawyers, and you go, well, no, it's not. This is the real politics of it. It's just not going to happen.
But do you think you can be brutally realistic and hopeful? Is that a balance that you've found motivates you to keep doing things?
I just do things because I'm a bit slow. I mean, if you're going to do a perfect cost, if you're not even a perfect, even a rough and dirty cost benefit analysis, you just kind of give up. But again, you actually, there's a whole, the way that I'll answer it, and it sort of comes down to almost like an obligation. When I mentioned Andrew Little coming to visit us last year, and when we're up in Mo'ofongo, in the whare up there, because we gave a presentation there, and we had all of our tupuna up on the wall. And we said to the minister, look, these are the people that dreamed about us but never saw us. We are their dream. And the time will come when we're on the ball too. And we are the ones that are dreaming about the children we'll never see. So I can be, how do you say to a niece who's really excited about getting married and starting a life and that sort of thing, and career and children and all of that stuff, and say, well, thanks to the dairy industry, it's all just a bit hopeless. But it's not just the dairy industry, it's a bit hard on them. But they are, as I said, there are the unsolvable problems. And every country has its unsolvable problems. Australia can't have a sensible conversation about coal. It's just impossible for them to do that. You just go around different countries, so they have their problems. And with us, the difficult conversations tend to be around things around agriculture. We just can't have those conversations. But again, it's all symptomatic of, as I said, of an economy that its deep down fundamental architecture is a colonial economy. And a colonial economy is based on exploitation. And it's the exploitation of people, and it's the exploitation of the environment. That's how it works. And that's why it's a death machine.
I think I get what you're saying about thinking about children in the future. I know that's something that keeps coming up in conversations with people like young adults, my sort of age, of like, well, what does it even mean to bring children into a world that seems so bleak and the future seems so hopeless? It's like quite a really profound
it is
challenge to grapple with. Yeah. Do you want to ask the last question about books?
Okay. Bit more light-hearted, I think, than our conversation so far. But the final question we have for you is, what books are you reading at the moment? Are there any books which have been formational for you that you would recommend to us?
I'd love to say that I used to read a lot, and I just don't have time, which is really tragic. So, there's a thing which says is that if it's important, you make time. So there's almost an admission that it's not important. So I'll put my hand up and say that. The book that I'm reading at the moment is one that I've been meaning to read for absolute years. And I actually found, when my wife was tidying up our bookshelf, and found it on the bloody bookshelf. And it's actually Charles Upham's biography. Now, Upham was a New Zealand soldier during World War II, and is the only combat soldier to have got 2 Victoria Crosses. And so quite an for a generation of New Zealanders, Upham was almost like what you aspired a New Zealander to be. he contained some amazing characteristics which were quite defining. Now, one of the reasons I've sort of wanted to read that is that Upham was a really humble guy, and to be honest, was an absolutely terrible peacetime soldier. He couldn't march. He had no sense of rhythm. If you have no sense of rhythm, you can't march. He didn't like it very much. He thought it was all a waste of time. What he had was a deep hatred of what the German Nazi Party was doing, and on the basis of that, a deep hatred of German soldiers, and so was actually quite good at dispatching them, hence getting 2 Victoria Crosses. What I just wanted to really look at with that book was really say they had an existential crisis, and how did they handle it? What were the sort of people? I mean, as I said, Upham, and he's not alone. If you really want to do a counterattack on Malamy Airfield, when the trucks don't turn up and the Australians are late because they got strafed and it's all a bloody mess, Upham's exactly the guy you want. Now, his commander was a guy called Kippenberger, Sir Howard Kippenberger, and another very famous New Zealand name, which is not so much resonance now, but of a generation or so ago, was very well known. Now, he was arguably New Zealand's most intellectually gifted officer, at least of the Second World War, probably full stop. Lawyer by trade, came from Canterbury, spent most of the interwar years actually reading. So he'd be the person you want to know and ask him what books he would have read. The reason I like Kippenberger is that in 1949, after the war, he was president of the RSA because he was a brigadier. In fact, he ended up being a major general, which in the New Zealand Army is actually pretty damn good. So, and he actually led the New Zealand division for a time at Casino. But what he came out against was the 1949 All Black tour to South Africa. And his argument was pretty simple. He said, I was in a division which had Maori soldiers. And if it was good enough for them to wear the uniform of their country in North Africa and in Greece and in Crete and in Italy, then it's reasonable enough to wear the uniform of their country in South Africa on a rugby field. Now, it's one thing in 1960 to say no Maori, no tour. It's another thing to protest in 1976 and in 1981. But in 1949, that's a big ballsy call. And so one of the reasons I wanted to read that is I knew both of them were in there, and it was just really to sort of say is that there is someone who had an incredible amount of physical bravery. Charlie wasn't crazy. If you look at his actions in an uncritical sense, the bravery was such that it looks like as if he was crazy. But what he was very good was at making a judgment around risks, and he was an excellent soldier. And what you had with Kippenberger was someone that actually had some moral fortitude. And the thing which was interesting is that the physical one was rewarded, and the moral fortitude was basically destroyed. So that's the book that I'm reading at the moment. Now, in terms of I think really one of the most seminal books or reports I read is actually Morgan Williams when he was the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. Would have been about 2003, 2004. Put out a publication, Growing for Good. And what it did is it made the link between, and quite emphatically so, between the growth of dairy intensification, the use of nitrogen, and the degradation of freshwater and lowland rivers, or basically New Zealand lowland freshwater. Now, in many ways, that, in my view, is the New Zealand equivalent of Silent Spring, which basically blew the whistle on DDT, or mass use of DDT. Now, again, there's a really interesting juxtaposition there, is that DDT was very quickly taken away as an industrial and agricultural pesticide.
What is DDT?
DDT is a pesticide. It was invented, they discovered it during World War II, and it was very good at killing mosquitoes.
Right.
And because it was very good at killing mosquitoes, it was very good at killing bugs, because if you kill one type of bug, you tend to kill the whole lot of them. So if you wanted to increase agricultural yields, if you can get rid of all the bugs, that was a pretty good thing. So in the years after World War II, farmers would just absolutely douse their crops in DDT, and it killed the bugs. And you had these huge increase in yields. Now we then get, genetic resistance turning up and a whole bunch of things like that. But there's a good example about how DDT was used badly. If DDT had been used in terms of malaria control, that sort of thing like that, perfectly sensible, fantastic tool. But again, what it was done was appropriated by the Western world and the affluent Western world and used really quite inappropriately. Now, the big sort of burning platform they had was that a link was made, and again, I don't know to the extent that the link was actually scientifically proven, but it was at least argued at the time, was that DDT led to the thinning of eggshells in birds, which meant that the eggs didn't hatch and the birds died. Hence the whole idea of silent spring, is that you'd have a spring where there'd be no birds. And that really captured the public imagination. It just and in the States in particular, they juxtaposed it with the bald eagle. They said, can you have America where the bald eagle is extinct? That was kind of the argument that they ran. So DDT was actually regulated out of existence, because in the US they could have that conversation. But the similar conversations in New Zealand, we can't have those conversations.
And it's synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is our DDT.
Well, synthetic, these again, there is a nexus in here. If you're trying to effectively put a water-hungry animal into a water-scarce area, basically on a beach, then you have to put a huge amount of inputs into it. Now, water is one of the inputs, the other one is fertiliser. So to actually be able to do those stock numbers, this is why New Zealand's fertiliser use has absolutely gone through the ceiling. Because, if you're trying to irrigate a beach, you've got to put fertiliser on it. There's another reason why it's just a totally unsustainable, morally degenerate form of agricultural activity.
And that report makes those links.
Yeah, it does. It does, and it just went boom, and we go, oh, okay, yep, that all makes sense. So that, in terms of, there's these other lots of reports I've read, when I was doing health economics and other sort of things like that. There's plenty of things which I've sort of looked at over the years. But if I had to sort of think about what really stands out as something that is really seminal and is relevant to New Zealand and has remained relevant over time. Because this is the thing, is that you look back on something, because this is now almost 20 odd years ago, and you look at reports from 20 years ago and they're a bit dated. I mean, it was on the basis of that report that, and this would be about, I got to this point, probably around 2005, 2006, I was kind of running a peak dairy argument in New Zealand. Because at that stage, New Zealand was growing at about 3% compounding annual growth rate of dairy production. And if you look as late as 2015, Fonterra was projecting forward basically a 3% compounding rate of growth, basically forever. In fact, the John Key-led national government, they put together a bunch of policies called the Business Growth Agenda, came out around 2012. And cutting right to the chase of that, what they wanted to do was double New Zealand's exports in real terms as a percentage of GDP. Now, that's a really bold thing to do, and dairy played a really big part of it, which is why so much money was put into irrigation at the time, because it was basically expanding the dairy industry, which is one of the heavy lifting engines which they wanted to do to increase exports. And you look through that and you can sort of say, well, what that report showed us was that we should never have gone down that track. We should never have gone down that track. And what the report still shows us is we actually need to reverse the track. The problem is, as a country, we can't have that conversation. It's just not possible.
Yeah, maybe I should read that report.
Yeah, it's not a hard one at all to read. And it was, I talked to Morgan Williams after it, a number of years later, and I commented on. I said, look, that's actually one of the most seminal papers of my career. And he said, well, look, that was one that we put an enormous amount of effort into, and it sort of shows it was an enormous amount of effort.
Maybe more people should read that.
Yeah, and it just cuts through so much sort of crap. And where we're at is a situation where why the solutions are quite simple. Get rid of 1 million cows. That's your starting point. And a whole lot of, we basically, all of our Paris emission targets, we suddenly met them. Nothing else. Don't plant a single tree. We've nailed it with our line. We can actually make some sensible conversations around what we're going to do about water. Some sensible conversations around land use. Because we're probably not going to go and put sheep back where they were. So what we can actually start to say is that there's whole areas we can start to think about around let's put back into indigenous forests. There's, I talked to Maori in the Wairarapa, and what I see we need to do there is what we've done is completely ruin the entire catchment, in that we allow the water to move across it far too quickly. So it falls on the hills with no trees. So forests are really good for, one, reducing the impact of rain coming down so you don't get erosion and that sort of thing, but then actually holding the water there and releasing it slowly. You then have rivers that have got enough room to actually move so that they can naturally go up or down with floods or not with floods. We've turned them into drains. We had wetlands that basically acted like sponges, and we've drained them all. In fact, if you go around Lake Wairarapa, there's a huge irony there, because this is we talked about, the eels and that sort of thing before. There's areas which used to be wetland, which is now drained, which are now too dry, so they irrigate in summer.
Wow.
Now, tell me how that is vaguely sensible and that is vaguely defendable. Now, what I'd be really interested to find out, if someone did a calculation that back in the day, they would have taken an enormous amount of eels off that. Now, I'd be really interested to find out in terms of protein per hectare, because we know that the cows produce about 1,000 kgs of milk solids a year. Now, that's a mixture of fats and proteins, so it'll be less than 1,000, but I'm pretty sure that they could get more than 1,000 kilos worth of eel protein off the same area. So this is going back to, if you actually wanted to feed the people, you'd probably get rid of the cows and you'd probably put back what you took away.
Yeah. And then that works for environmental
Yeah,
systems.
and there's a whole bunch of things around that as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for giving us so much of your time.
Yeah.
It's been really great to hear about all of those issues in so much detail. I don't think there's a lot there that I didn't know. I have no background in economics. Justine does. But yeah, it's really good.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.